The year was 1867, and the frontier carried the kind of silence that made a man question whether he was alive or halfway to the grave. The town of Red Hollow was little more than a sagging street of boardwalks, one trading post, and a saloon that reeked of spilled whiskey and stale sweat. On a cold March night, lamps flickered weakly against the wind that rattled the shutters. Inside, the saloon was packed with ranch hands, drifters, and a few men who carried the look of wolves pretending to be sheep. The air smelled of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies, and the only music came from a broken piano being half-heartedly played by a drunk. At a corner table, 5 men sat hunched over cards. The stakes had climbed higher than the ranchers crowding the room were used to. Coins clinked, pistols rested on the table like extra players, and the tension coiled tight enough to snap. The man who had drawn every eye that night was Ezekiel Hart, a rancher who lived alone on 3,000 acres of grassland south of town. He was broad-shouldered, scarred across the jaw from a cavalry saber, and his pale eyes carried something unsettled. Folks whispered he was half-feral since the war. He seldom spoke, never smiled, and didn't bother with company. Men said he was the kind to shoot first, bury later. Women crossed the street when he passed. That night, Hart's face showed nothing as he set down his hand. 3 aces fanned like the wings of a black crow. The gambler across from him cursed and slammed a fist on the table. Samuel Pike was his name, a gaunt man with greasy hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He'd been winning most of the night, cheating his way with marked cards and quick fingers. But now his pile of coins was gone, his whiskey glass empty, and the shadows of men he owed money to lurked against the back wall. "You can't walk away yet, Hart," Pike said, voice slick as oil. "One more hand." Hart pushed back his chair, preparing to leave. "I've had my fill." "Sit." Pike snapped, then forced a grin when the room grew quiet. "I've still got something to wager." From the doorway came a sound that did not belong in a saloon. A muffled cry. 2 figures were shoved inside by one of Pike's debt collectors. Girls, no older than 16 and 13, dressed in worn calico, cheeks streaked with tears. They clutched each other's hands like shipwreck survivors. The room went still. Even the piano ceased its sour notes. "This here's collateral," Pike announced, his voice too loud. "My nieces. Strong, healthy, and worth more than coin to a man who knows how to put 'em to work. I'll stake 'em against the pot." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men laughed uneasily, others spat on the floor. One old ranch hand muttered, "Hell's fire, Pike, you've gone too far." But Pike's eyes glittered with desperation. "You want her debts paid, you let me play 'em. One hand. Winner takes all." Hart's gaze slid to the girls. They were trembling, eyes wide as trapped deer. Their small shoulders shook beneath threadbare shawls. For a moment, no one breathed. Hart's jaw tightened. He set himself back down at the table, his silence louder than Pike's swagger. Cards were dealt. The room leaned forward. Pike licked his lips, fingers twitching, eyes darting. Hart held his hand steady as stone. When the final bet was laid, Pike smirked, showing his cards with a flourish. 2 pair, kings high. He reached for the girls with a greedy grin. Then Hart laid down his hand. 4 of a kind. Queens. Gasps filled the room. Pike's grin died. The pot, the girls, all of it slid toward the rancher in a silence broken only by the girl's soft sobs. Hart stood, his chair scraping harsh against the floorboards. He said nothing, but his shadow fell long over the gambler as he took hold of the girl's shoulders and guided them out the door. Men stepped aside like parting water. No one dared challenge him. Outside, the cold air slapped sharp against the night. The girls shivered, their thin dresses no defense against the wind. Hart untied his horse and wagon from the hitching post. Without a word, he lifted them into the wagon bed. Their eyes darted to him, filled with terror. They thought they had been traded to a monster, and maybe to their eyes he looked like one, scarred, silent, his presence heavy as iron. The ride out of town was long and hushed, the only sounds the creak of wheels and the distant howl of coyotes. The younger girl whimpered, and the older wrapped an arm around her, whispering comfort. Hart kept his eyes on the trail, face unreadable. Hours passed before the dark outline of his ranch rose against the prairie. A lonely place, one sprawling barn, a main house with a sagging porch, and wide emptiness stretching in every direction. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust. The wagon jolted to a stop. Hart climbed down, then extended a hand. The girls flinched. His hand dropped. He turned instead, walked to the door, and pushed it open. The fire inside had burned low, the air cool. He struck a match, lit a lamp, and set 2 plates on the table. Bread and salted meat waited. "Eat," he said, voice rough as gravel. It was the first word he had spoken to them. They hesitated, but hunger gnawed deeper than fear. Slowly they obeyed. He watched only long enough to be sure they swallowed, then turned away, busying himself with the fire. They studied him with nervous eyes. The younger whispered, "What's he going to do with us?" The older shook her head. "Don't talk." That night, Hart spread bedrolls by the fire. He gave them blankets, thick and warm, then retreated to the far side of the room. He lay down on the floor without removing his boots, rifle within reach. The girls lay stiff under the blankets, listening to the wind press against the walls. They thought of the gambler's cruel eyes, the smoke of the saloon, and the stranger who had claimed them. Tears slipped silently onto their pillows. At dawn, Hart rose first. He stepped outside into the chill, split wood with methodical strokes, then came in and set the stove going. When the girls stirred, he pointed to the water bucket. "Washington, then chores." His tone left no space for argument. The ranch was no place for idleness. He put them to work gathering eggs, sweeping the floor, tending the fire. Every task was given with curt instructions. He rarely looked at them, never raised his voice, but his silence felt like a weight pressing down. They whispered together when he was out of earshot, inventing stories of what he might do when night fell. The younger asked if he would sell them to someone worse. The older only squeezed her hand tighter, unsure herself. Yet there were small things that unsettled their fear. At mealtime, he placed their portions before his own, waiting until they had eaten before touching his food. When the wind rattled the windows, he checked the shutters to be sure they would not shiver. Once, when he found a hole in the younger girl's shoe, he carried it wordlessly to his workbench and patched the sole, setting it back by her bed before dawn. She woke to find it mended, too startled even to speak.
But his silence kept suspicion alive. In the evenings, as the fire burned low, the girls whispered of escape. The prairie stretched endless, but the thought of staying in his care twisted their stomachs. Still, when the coyotes howled at night, they pressed closer to the blankets he had left them, torn between dread and a strange sense of safety. Days stretched into a week. The rhythm of ranch life settled over them, though the fear never fully left. They learned his name from the markings on his saddle. Ezekiel Hart. Men in town had called him dangerous. Alone in his house, he looked every bit of it, moving with the controlled stillness of a man who expected the world to strike him at any moment. Yet the harshness of his face softened in small moments the girls could not explain, the way he paused to watch the horizon at sunset, or the way his hands, scarred though they were, handled a wounded calf with surprising gentleness. Still, they wondered, was this man their jailer, or something else? Each night the question followed them to sleep, unanswered, pressing heavier as the wind moaned through the gaps in the walls. On the 7th night, the older girl woke to find another blanket laid over her shoulders. She turned, half expecting to see Hart looming nearby. But the room was dark. His form stretched across the far corner where he always slept, rifle at his side. She lay back down, whispering into the shadows. "Why'd he do that?" The younger stirred beside her. "Maybe he ain't as mean as he looks." The older stared into the darkness, unsure. Outside, the prairie wind howled like a warning. Inside, the fire burned low, casting Hart's face in flickering shadow, stern, unreadable, yet touched with something the girls could not name. They thought they had been handed to a monster. But as the nights wore on, the truth lingered just out of reach, waiting, like thunder on the horizon. The first signs of the storm came with a low moan that rolled across the prairie like the growl of some great beast. By dusk the sky was bruised purple, the air sharp with the taste of snow. The girls hurried through their chores under Ezekiel Hart's curt instructions, tying shutters, dragging buckets, pulling hay to the barn. The older girl kept her eyes lowered, afraid of his silence, though she could feel it pressing against her back as he worked alongside them. The younger stumbled, arms full of kindling, and Hart caught her by the elbow before she fell. His grip was firm, not cruel, but she looked up at him with wide eyes and scurried on without a word. By nightfall the blizzard struck. Snow slashed sideways, driven by a wind that screamed through the cracks in the barn. The horses stamped and whinnied, eyes rolling white. Hart waded through drifts, rope coiled around his arm, jaw set. The girls tried to help, struggling against the gale, their skirts snapping like sails. The older shouted above the roar, "The roof!" Even as she cried out, the timbers groaned. A section gave way with a splintering crack. She was buried in snow and straw, vanishing under the weight. Hart moved without thought. One moment he was at the door, the next he was plunging into the wreckage. Boards clawed at his shoulders, snow blinded his eyes. He dug with bare hands, teeth clenched. For a heartbeat there was nothing but whiteness and silence, then he seized a frail arm. He hauled the girl free, pressed her to his chest, and staggered toward the house with the younger running behind, sobbing. Inside, he laid the girl before the fire, her face blue with cold. He tore off his coat, wrapping it around her, then ordered the younger, "Water! Hot!" His voice was low, urgent, carrying more concern than command. The storm raged through the night, but the house held. By dawn, the older girl stirred, coughing, breath thin but alive. She opened her eyes to find Hart sitting close, head bowed as though in prayer. When he saw her move, he only nodded once, then turned back to stoke the fire. She whispered hoarsely, "Why did you save me?" He looked at her then, pale eyes shadowed, and said, "Because no one else would." The blizzard passed, leaving the land buried beneath drifts. For days they were trapped inside, the world reduced to the crackle of firewood and the sound of wind clawing at the walls. In that confinement something shifted. Hart spoke more, short words, but words all the same. "Eat. Rest. You're safe." His voice was rough, yet beneath it lay a current the girls had not expected, gentleness hidden under stone. The younger began to watch him with cautious curiosity instead of dread. The older, though, remained wary, studying him like a puzzle she could not yet solve. One night, unable to sleep, the younger crept from her bedroll. The house was quiet save for the hiss of embers. She saw a small box half hidden on a shelf. Curiosity pulled her closer. Inside lay a silver locket, dulled with age. She snapped it open and froze. Inside was the portrait of a woman with soft eyes, and two small children smiling faintly. The likeness was blurred, but the love etched in their faces was not. She touched the image, then felt a presence behind her. Hart stood in the shadows, expression unreadable. She stammered, I was just—" He took the locket gently from her hands, closed it, and set it back without a word. For a long moment he stared at the dying fire, his jaw tight. Then he said quietly, "They're gone." His voice cracked like dry timber. The girl fled back to her blanket, but the words lingered, sharp as broken glass. From then on, the girls saw him differently. He was not only the silent rancher who had won them in a game of chance. He was a man carved by loss. The older pieced together whispers she'd heard in town, the rumors that his family had perished when raiders burned his homestead, that the war had left him with nothing but scars. She watched him with new eyes, the hardness in his face less frightening now that she glimpsed the grief behind it. The thaw came slow, but with it new dangers. Samuel Pike, the gambler, had not forgotten what he had lost. One morning the sound of hoofbeats carried across the prairie. Hart stepped from the barn, rifle in hand, as 4 riders appeared on the horizon, Pike among them, his grin as vicious as ever. "Hart!" he called, reining in at the gate. "You got something belongs to me." Hart's voice was steady. "You lost fair." Pike's smile thinned. "Fair's a word for fools. I'll have the girls back, and whatever else you got worth taking." The standoff was taut, the cold air snapping between them. Pike's men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their guns. The girls, peering from the doorway, clung to each other, hearts hammering. Hart's rifle never wavered. The silence stretched, then broke with a shot. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked. Horses screamed. The girls ducked, screaming as splinters flew. Hart moved like a man born to it, quick, efficient, deadly. He dropped one rider with a single round, then swung to fire again. Bullets tore into the porch, one grazing his shoulder. Blood bloomed dark against his shirt. He didn't falter. By the time the smoke cleared, 2 men lay dead in the dirt, another fled wounded, and Pike was galloping back toward town, cursing vengeance. Hart leaned against the doorframe, blood dripping down his arm. The older girl rushed to him, fear burning into something else. "Sit," she ordered, voice trembling. He tried to wave her off, but her eyes flashed. "Sit." He obeyed. The younger fetched water and cloth, hands shaking. They cleaned the wound, tears streaking their faces. The older whispered, "You could have died." He met her gaze, eyes softer than she'd ever seen, and said, "Wouldn't be the first time." She shook her head fiercely. "Don't say that. You saved us." Again. That night they refused to sleep apart from him. They dragged their blankets close to where he lay by the fire, as though their presence might keep death at bay. The younger murmured as she drifted off, "He ain't our captor. He's our protector." The older lay awake longer, staring into the darkness, torn between fear and a strange, growing loyalty. She remembered the locket, the family lost to fire. Perhaps, she thought, they had not been given to a monster at all, but to a man who had already lost everything he loved. And perhaps, though they had not chosen it, they were becoming something to him that he could not say aloud. Days passed in uneasy quiet. Hart's wound healed under their care, and with each sunrise the distance between them shrank. The younger began to hum while she worked, unafraid of his silence. The older found herself listening for his footsteps, watching his face for traces of the man behind the scars. But the memory of Pike's promise lingered like a storm cloud. Trouble was not done with them. The prairie was wide, the law thin, and vengeance a seed that grew fast in men like Samuel Pike. Still, for the first time since that night in the saloon, the girls did not fall asleep with tears on their cheeks. For the first time, the older dreamed not of escape, but of survival, together. She knew Pike would return, and harder trials lay ahead. Yet as the fire crackled and Hart's steady breathing filled the quiet, she felt a fragile certainty forming, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. Whatever storms came, they would not face them alone. The thaw came sudden that spring, as if the prairie itself had grown weary of silence. Snowmelt turned the earth to mud, streams swelled, and the air was sharp with the scent of wet grass. For Ezekiel Hart, the change brought no peace. Each dawn he saddled his horse with a wary glance at the horizon, rifle close at hand. Pike was still out there. Hart could feel the man's shadow in the wind, the weight of unfinished reckoning. The girls sensed it too, though none spoke of it outright. They moved quicker with their chores, eyes darting whenever hoofbeats echoed in the distance. Hearts braced for the day the gambler returned to finish what he had begun. One morning, with stores dwindling, Hart hitched the wagon. "We ride to the post," he said, voice clipped. The older girl frowned. "It's dangerous." He nodded once. "So's hunger." That was the end of it. The 3 of them set out, the wagon groaning over the thawing earth, the younger girl bundled against the chill, the older sitting stiff beside him, silent. Hart's face betrayed nothing, but his hand never strayed far from the rifle resting across his knees. The journey was rough. Rivers swollen with meltwater cut across the trail, and at one crossing the current clawed at the wheels, threatening to drag the wagon downstream. Hart snapped the reins, muscles straining as the horses bucked against the pull. The girls clung to the seat, screaming as water sloshed over their boots. For a moment it seemed the river would claim them whole, but with a final heave Hart drove the team onto solid ground. They sat soaked and shivering, hearts hammering. The younger sobbed into her sister's arms, and for the first time the older reached for Hart, her hand gripping his sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered, voice raw. He met her eyes, gave the slightest nod, then turned back to the trail without a word. By the time they reached the trading post, dusk had begun to creep over the land. The place bustled with rough men, wagons, and cattle, the stench of manure and wood smoke heavy in the air. Hart guided the girls inside. Conversations hushed when he entered. Old faces turned away quickly, others whispered. The girls caught fragments. "That's him, the one lost his wife and daughters, burned out by raiders." The words cut sharp. They looked at Hart with new eyes, seeing not just the scarred silence but the grave he carried within him. The younger reached for his hand. He allowed it, the first time he had not pulled away from such a gesture. Supplies were bought swiftly, but whispers followed them out like wolves. And with the whispers came Pike. He appeared near the hitching post, flanked by fresh men, his grin stretched wide. "Hart," he drawled, voice slick as poison. "Thought you could hide behind your fences. But here you are." The girls froze, fear flashing. Hart's body went still as carved stone. "Take your step back," he warned. Pike laughed. "Still playing father to what you stole. You think they'll call you savior? You're nothing but a broken man with a broken gun." Men began to gather, hungry for spectacle. Pike's hand hovered over his holster. Hart's voice carried low but steady. "You don't walk away, you won't walk at all." Tension snapped taut. But Pike wasn't ready yet. Not here, not with the town watching. He spat at the mud, eyes burning. "Enjoy your little family, Hart. It won't last. Next time, no one will stand between us." Then he swung onto his horse and rode into the gathering dark. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering. Hart loaded the wagon in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing down. The girls said nothing, but they clung close as they rode home, every shadow along the trail thick with threat. Back at the ranch, unease hung heavier than smoke. Hart worked longer hours, eyes always on the ridgeline, waiting. The girls, once timid, now began to shoulder more of the burden, their fear hardening into determination. The older learned to load a rifle under his patient instruction, her hands trembling but steadying with each attempt. The younger fed the horses without flinching at their kicks, humming softly as she worked. Hart watched them with a quiet ache, glimpses of what he had lost stirring painfully in their faces. At night, when the fire burned low, he would look at the locket and see not just the family gone, but the one slowly forming before him, fragile as new glass. The storm broke 2 weeks later. The sky was heavy, the wind restless. From the porch Hart saw them, Pike and 6 men riding hard across the prairie, rifles glinting. He turned to the girls. "Inside. Bar the doors." His voice left no room for argument, but the older girl shook her head, fear sharp in her eyes yet steadiness beneath it. "We won't leave you." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no time. The riders closed in, dust rising like smoke. Gunfire erupted as they reached the gate. Bullets tore through the barn, shattering wood. Hart dropped one man clean off his horse with a single shot, then swung to fire again. Pike's men fanned out, circling. The girls huddled inside until the younger, hands shaking, grabbed a kettle of boiling water from the stove. "We can't just hide," she whispered. Together they dragged it toward the door. Outside, Hart fought like a man with nothing left to lose. He ducked behind a trough, fired, rolled, reloaded. A bullet slammed into his side, staggering him. He gritted his teeth, pressed a hand to the wound, and kept firing. Pike advanced, pistol flashing, voice rising. "You can't save them, Hart. You never could save anyone." The words cut deeper than the bullet. Hart stumbled, vision narrowing. Pike raised his gun for the killing shot. Then the door flew open. The older girl hurled the boiling water, scalding one of Pike's men, who screamed and dropped his weapon. The younger screamed at the top of her lungs, drawing eyes just long enough. Hart, half blind with pain, lifted his rifle. The shot cracked loud as thunder. Pike staggered, eyes wide, mouth spilling red. He crumpled into the dirt, the sneer wiped clean forever. The remaining men broke, fleeing into the prairie, leaving only silence and smoke behind. Hart swayed, the rifle slipping from his grasp. The girls ran to him, catching him as he fell to his knees. Blood soaked his shirt, his breath ragged. The older pressed her hands against the wound, tears streaking her face. "Don't you leave us," she begged. He looked at her, pain carved deep, and for the first time his voice shook. "I never meant to win you. But maybe the Lord meant to give you back to me." His eyes closed, and he sagged against them. The girls held him, sobbing, refusing to let go. At last his chest rose with a ragged breath, alive, barely, but alive. Relief broke through their tears. They dragged him inside, tended him through the long night. He drifted in and out, muttering fragments of the past, names, places, the fire that had taken his wife and daughters. The girls listened, hearts breaking and mending at once. By dawn his fever eased, and when his eyes opened, they were met not with fear but with the sight of two girls who had chosen to stay by him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The days that followed were slow, marked by bandages and whispered prayers. Hart healed with their care, though the scar would remain. The girls worked harder, carried heavier loads, laughter slowly creeping back into their voices. Hart watched them with quiet wonder. The weight on his shoulders lightened for the first time in years. At sunset he would sit on the porch, the locket in his hand, and see not just what he had lost but what he had gained. They sat with him, one on each side, no longer afraid of his silence. The prairie stretched wide and endless, but it no longer felt empty. Where once there had been loneliness and ghosts, there was now the fragile shape of family. It was not the one he had buried, but it was life given back all the same. And when the wind carried the distant cry of coyotes, the girls no longer trembled. They leaned against him, warm and certain, knowing the truth at last. They had not been won like cattle or coin. They had been saved. And he, in turn, had been saved by them. So what do we take from this tale? That the frontier could strip a man bare, take his family, his hope, and his name. But sometimes, when the cards were down and the world seemed empty, it could also give back what was most needed. Not riches, not land, but the chance to begin again. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.